Hi, everyone. Everybody hear me okay? What an amazing day this has been already. Are you guys having a great time? Me too. We're going to take a little bit of a departure from the previous topic and talk a bit about story. Story is the most important and powerful way of getting your ideas out into the world. It's the way in which we build connection with each other. It's the way in which we build support for a cause. It's the way in which we change the world, from the school board to the water board to everything in between. It's an incredibly, incredibly powerful thing. And there are countless ways to think about how to develop and use story. And, for me, at this moment in time, as I think about the advent of technology and social media and the opportunities for getting your story out there are literally just endless, if you will. There are so many ways to ultimately tell your story. It's only limited by your own creativity and your own imagination. So today on this panel, we're going to share some examples of the ways in which the three of us share and put stories out there, the way in which we tell stories, build support for ideas. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. As our announcer said, I am a very proud Policy Circle board member of several years. I'm an adjunct professor at American University and also the host and founder of She Said podcast, which I urge you all to take a listen to. Sylvie was my very first guest, and she actually, to digress for a second and tell you a quick story, Sylvie is actually the muse for She Said podcast. When I met Sylvie, we connected immediately. I told her what I was working on, focused on women's leadership development, and she said, "You've got to come and facilitate a panel at the Policy Circle Summit." So in year 2, I came, hosted a conversation about women using our unique voices. Sylvie called me 2 days later and said, "This has to be a podcast." And 100 days later, She Said podcast was born. We have evolved and hopefully improved over the course of that period of time, but she was my muse. And I love that story because it illustrates so many different elements of what we're talking about today, that power of connection and that network and that inspiration that we get from each other. Sylvie, of course, is joining us remotely, as you all know, and we're so happy to have her. She, of course, is the co-founder and visionary behind the Policy Circle. She also happens to be a newly minted author. Hopefully you all had a chance to pick up your tote bags that include a copy of her fabulous book, Trust Your Voice, which we're going to talk a little bit about that aspect of storytelling. There she is. Hi, Sylvie.
Hi.
Sylvie and I are joined by the amazing Jenna Lee. Jenna is a former television anchor and broadcast journalist turned entrepreneur. And she has an amazing platform, a couple of businesses that she's built. Leap Media, LLC, is her parent organization. And then Smart Her News, which if you're not currently tuned into, you must follow her on Instagram. It's fantastic, and she illustrates so much of what we're talking about related to storytelling. We are all storytellers, all of us in this room, the three of us on this panel, and we're going to break down some elements of what makes storytelling most effective. So with that, ladies, Jenna, Sylvie, welcome. Let's get started and talk about how each of you think about story from your vantage point. Jenna, I'm going to start with you, and I'd love for you to talk a bit about Smart Her News and why it was important for you. You had a big national platform, but you made a big career pivot. Maybe talk about why that was important from the standpoint of telling stories.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being here. Thank you so much to the Policy Circle as well. This is just an amazing event. I'm so honored to be included in this conversation. You were so right to point out that we're storytelling on a regular basis. So whether you're a journalist or not, we're storytelling all the time, whether or not we realize it. So how are you doing? What did you do today? What's the weather like? What did you think of this conversation? We're telling these micro stories all the time. And the reason why I became a journalist is because I love telling stories. It's really that simple. I like gathering information and making it very accessible and interesting. That's what a journalist is set out to do, and that's what I've done for really the last more than 15 years at this point. And as you pointed out, at a certain point in my career, I didn't start out thinking I was going into broadcast news. I, quite frankly, just checked that box because at Columbia University, where I was doing my graduate studies for journalism, you could choose one. And I was paying my own way through school, and broadcast meant that you could learn a lot of different modalities. And I thought, well, I'll just check that. I should do, you know, 2 for the price of 1. I'm going into an amazing amount of debt anyways. I'll check that one. And so that's how I ended up really following the path towards broadcast news. But pulling this all together, you know, we're at an event that we're really talking about some of our most precious resources in the world. And effective storytelling really is connected with our most precious resource, which is time. If you are an effective storyteller, you do not waste your time or someone else's. And we know even in a few words, you can change somebody's perspective or enlighten someone to a new topic. My job as a journalist has never been to convince somebody to have a certain point of view about something, but we all know those moments where you wake up, and maybe it's already happened today with some of our sessions, where you thought, that just opened like a little passageway in my thinking that it wasn't available before. So that's the thrill of storytelling for me as a journalist. And the churn towards smarter news was very complicated in many ways. I didn't expect to walk away from my career. I was a 5-day-a-week news anchor on the Fox News channel. I did 2 hours a day for 7 years. It was a dream job. It was a huge audience and very high profile, but I wanted to deliver nonpartisan information. And I knew that my calling was for something different, that we weren't making lives easier for people. We weren't providing customer service. And I thought news and healthy storytelling is about returning customer service to news delivery. And so Smarter News is about that. It's a platform where it's quick bites of high quality information, hopefully seamlessly throughout your day, and figuring out how do we provide that for the customer. Storytelling is not about the storyteller. It's actually about the audience. And it's the biggest mistake that people make, whether they're in journalism or otherwise. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that later.
Very well said. I love that. I want to pivot, Sylvie, to you, recognizing we may have just a tiny delay, so I ask you guys to be patient with us if we have a second. Sylvie, maybe if you could share a little bit about how you think about the importance of storytelling and how you've seen it work as it relates to the policy circle.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Laura. And it's great to participate. And I hope everyone can see me and hear me well. You know, it's interesting how first, when we were preparing for this panel and thinking about stories, for the policy circle, the stories that we gather are stories of information, of transformation. I mean, stories of transformations in people, stories of action, of making a difference, of not only just changing maybe your thinking, but in what you are doing. And the policy circle is almost like a launching pad for someone to find a new focus and change the trajectory of their lives. And it's certainly, as I was reflecting back and writing my book, actually, I realized that the policy circle, building the policy circle, has completely transformed who I am and the trajectory of my life. And those are the kinds of stories that we are interested in telling and sharing. And we call them stories of impact. And we call it the policy circle effect, and then the story of impact. So I think that's where I'm coming from when I think about it with the policy circle. And like Jenna said, the challenge is how do we capture those stories? And actually, how do we get women to share those stories? Because we all have a story to say, and a lot of times we just don't think that it's necessarily worth sharing. And so that is the biggest challenge. And I think for everyone listening today is to realize you have a story, you are a story, and it's worthwhile sharing it because it inspires others.
To talk a little bit about the podcast and how we think about storytelling from that standpoint, I'm going to pick up on something that Jenna said. And it's that notion that the story is not about the storyteller, it's about the audience. And the most effective women who have come on the podcast are those who recognize how to take that incredible skill of telling a story and incorporating action items that we can serve up to the audience so that she can take away from that, even though her experience may be dramatically different, there are relatable elements that she can pull from that conversation, which is both an efficient use of her time, and it's also really making that story that the storyteller has told stickier. Whatever that message is that she's trying to deliver is more likely to be memorable as a result of that. And so I have found it so interesting to think about many of the women, Sylvie included, who have come on the podcast. Nancy Brinker is another, who I oftentimes talk about because her power and her gift as a storyteller is really the secret to her success. It's how she built Susan G. Komen and raised, $3 billion, maybe more at this point, toward research and ultimately curing breast cancer. It's an incredible story, and it's all about this notion of storyteller. It's what makes her an effective fundraiser. So as we think about this topic, maybe how you've seen, Jenna, the evolution of story, if you will, and as you interview and talk to people, really that effective use of story. Maybe give us some examples of ways that you've seen people use story so effectively.
What we've enabled ourselves through technology is multiple ways to tell the story. And we all see that on a regular basis because even a still photo now, in many ways, is bringing us full circle to where we began in journalism, where we didn't have live moving picture. We didn't have the live camera angles that we have at this moment, which, by the way, we're actually utilizing in this very session. I just spoke with an Associated Press photographer for a story that I was doing, and he said, what he sees even in his career is that we're returning to some of the very basics of storytelling despite all these different resources. And I think one of the things that we see missing from stories in general, whether it's a corporation that's trying to tell their own story or someone that's trying to explain a point of view, or you have a business that you're trying to deliver a message, we have all of those catchphrases about branding and messaging, and that kind of puts a fog over getting to the heart of why you're even talking about the topic. The biggest thing that we miss from the news is really explaining why the story matters. How many times have you watched something on the news and you're like, why did I even watch? I don't even know, why did I even watch that segment? What's the big takeaway for me? Why? And really getting to the core of why the story matters is a fundamental exercise no matter what sort of story you're doing. Oftentimes we think we know why it matters because it's so obvious, whatever that reason is. Most of the time it's really not that obvious to other people.
Yeah.
And you have to really strip away what all that extra that you're adding in to just have an honest conversation with yourself. Why does it matter? And if you can't answer that question in 3 seconds, you don't know why the story matters. You really don't. So I hope that kind of answers your question. It is a missing ingredient in the storytelling, no matter how much it's evolved and changed. Some of the very basics of storytelling haven't, and they're the ones that are most missed.
Yeah, I love that. Sylvie, maybe share an example of a story that's come out of one of the policy circles or maybe out of the new Clear Leadership program. Maybe talk a bit about one of the stories that really has resonated with you.
Yeah, the stories that come out of the policy circle, as I said, are stories of transformation, of people discovering, making a connection with another person, and then it really kind of changed the course, their trajectories. And I'd like to maybe underline, Amanda Muldoon and Lindsay Hanna met at a policy circle event. And together, they just randomly, they didn't know each other. They decided to start a circle. They came to a summit in Chicago, and on the way there, they kind of got to know each other. And then they left the summit saying, yeah, let's do this. Let's host these conversations. And then through that, they expanded their network of their ecosystem of relationships in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They connected with each other. And then Hannah decided to run for a local office and ask Amanda to be her campaign manager. And Amanda had never done that before. She kind of rolled up her sleeve and did it, and then just became really involved in grassroots local campaigns, got invited during the 2020 cycle to participate in a TV show where they were featuring different political points of views, and becomes like advisor in grassroots politics, and recently was applied and selected to participate in a political leadership program in Indiana. It's called the Lugar Series. And she came from, her life completely changed. And I think that's the kind of transformation stories. That's an incredible stories, right? There's other stories of people connecting in a policy circle and deciding, we want to engage locally in our schools and drive and be the drivers of change or raise some issues. So the stories of the policy circles are first and foremost those of connections, and then of a focus of discovering a passion and following that passion and that interest and going from there. And it's inviting others. It's about expanding your network. So those are the types of stories that we gather, and it's just incredible what people start doing, just out of the clear program, someone will write an op-ed. Carrie McCormick, who's there, wrote an op-ed letter to the editor about hospice care. And that came out of feeling confident, feeling surrounded by people who are supportive that she could go to, and gave her the confidence to actually pick up a pen and submit a story to the paper. So I think those are the kinds of stories that we are trying to tell through the different mediums.
On that point that Sylvie just made about the different mediums, and maybe sort of open up a bit of a discussion with Jenna and Sylvie about how do you pick the right medium, right? How do you know whether it's a letter to the editor, whether it's an Instagram Live, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a book? How do you think about selection of the medium?
Anything that you're approaching from a strategic storytelling perspective has to be about what's the most easy for your audience. But it's also helpful if it's easy for you. And you don't want to walk away from something that's right in front of you. That was a lesson that I learned through Smarter News. I had taken some time away from broadcast news. I didn't necessarily get into journalism so that I could be on camera. And so I thought, maybe I can just build this entire platform without people seeing me. We could just hide and it'll be fine. And it turns out it wasn't. And one day I turned on a live Instagram feed while I was cooking breakfast for my kids, and we started talking about the news that way. And that opened up a huge growth opportunity for us that continues to today, which is that we use a live feed about 4 times a week just to talk about the news. And what I realized is that I could not do that in a setting like this where I actually got dressed and put on real clothes. If I waited to do that in my normal life, then I would never, ever do it. It would be 10 o'clock at night before that happened because life is busy. And I realized that for my audience that I'm trying to serve, which is mainly women across the country of all different political persuasions, that I had to make it easy for them. It had to be there for them when they needed it. And that meant doing it in the morning, and they actually appreciated the fact that it wasn't perfectly produced, that there are moments where my kids come in and interrupt us. And I've made some changes because certainly over the last year, the news cycle has become so serious that there are moments that's not appropriate. So it's not just a free-for-all, although sometimes it feels like that in more ways than one. But it's part of stripping away all the extra of the news to really focus on the story, right? You strip away all the great lighting and the perfect makeup, and let me tell you something, I miss that. Oh, I mean, that really, if I could do that on a regular basis, I would. But there is a joy. I have more impact through Smarter News with no makeup and a sweatshirt than I ever did on the Fox News channel, hands down. When we were doing a live on Afghanistan, we were one of the networks out there that actually had someone on the ground, a correspondent in Afghanistan. We were doing lives from my living room to Kabul. And the reach of our account in numbers was higher than the daily audience that I had at Fox News. So the ability to do that, I mean, it's really a tribute to our audience, because it's about them. If I waited, I would have missed the moment that they needed us. They needed us in that moment. And it wasn't perfect, but it works. And so finding that modality, like thinking about your audience, how am I going to meet them? Is it better for over text message? If it may just be that way, you know, it may be that they need a phone call. You just can't shy away from it, but whatever also seems easy for you, like listening to the news while you're getting ready, or if you're selling something, if there's a product, you realize that mainly you shop at night, like I do, like scrolling through while my husband's watching television, you know, if that's what you're naturally doing, that's probably what your audience is doing. And figuring out how to meet them exactly in whatever highway they're driving on is where you want to be. So that's why Instagram has been predominant for us, because that's where my audience is. I'd love to just be on a crusade and just back away from all social media and burn it down, you know, like all of us feel every once in a while, but I can't, because that's where my audience is, and I love them, and I want to take care of them, and that's where we need to be, is where they're at.
Yeah. Was it hard to let go of that very perfect image that you curate as a broadcast journalist?
Yeah, but I knew it was phony. So
if you guys, right, but the audience doesn't always, you know, I mean, you're naturally gorgeous, so you look good with or without makeup.
You know, the key to this is just it's fake eyelashes. That's the only, that's what I miss.
For those who do not tune in, and I know everyone's going to tune in to Smart Her News after this, but you'll see Jenna with her hair piled high and no makeup, yes. And it is very compelling, but it's always been a question I wanted to ask, is did it take you some time to get comfortable looking at yourself, you know, and just getting comfortable with the fact that you're not all dolled up,
you
right?
know, I mean, yes, my mother at one point, she's like, you know, like, do you think it would be good to just brush your hair? Like, what? You know what? She's right. Like, yeah, every week I look at myself and I'm like, oh my God, wow. You know, I mean, there's only so much natural lighting can help you. Like, it's really, yes, that is very hard. And even just being able to come and do something like this is such a nice, it's just nice to be in a more formal setting. And that's great. But humility is important in anything that you do. And one of the things I think is lacking from broadcasting is any humility at all. That's why you feel this elitism. And I'm not just talking about any one channel. I'm talking about media in general. You feel like you're being told something rather than having the news delivered to you. I often say, like, it's about, sometimes you feel like you ever go to a fancy restaurant and you don't really feel comfortable there? You know, like they know better, like the waiter knows better than you about the menu, and it's like not a very comfortable feeling. I think news should be like going to your hamburger joint down the block, where you feel like, you know, the food's not always great, because the news always isn't great, but you really like the people you're around, and you know that they actually care about you and your family. So I enjoyed broadcasting. I miss it, especially during big live news events, you know, like election night. I mean, those are fun. That's fun. That's why you get out. I mean, and you're very in the moment, and it's very hard to replicate that. What I miss most about the news is the crew. You know, the people that are doing audio and your camera work. Because those are your friends. Those are the people actually watching. You know, they're part of you.
And they're giving you feedback in the moment,
and they're talking
too,
to you about a segment during commercial. Like, that's what I miss. Do I miss the presentation of it? I miss it just for the same reason. You know, it's fun to get dressed up. Yes, I miss that, absolutely. But if our purpose is about impact, then that actually doesn't provide the impact. No one ever said to me, oh my gosh, that was an amazing story about that officer that saved that child's life, but your dress was, no, they're always about the story, right? And so if it's about the impact, it is that lesson sometimes in humility a little bit. And I mean real humility, as in humiliation sometimes, when you're like, I don't know if I should have turned on the camera that day at that time. That keeps you real and keeps the mission authentic. And I hope that no matter how much technology we develop, we remember that, because that's what makes us different.
Yeah, it's also tapping into this idea of being vulnerable with your audience, and trusting your audience. And Sylvie, I want to pivot to you. You have been such a visionary in starting the Policy Circle, but you took another big departure and embraced the role of author and told your story. And you and I have had an opportunity to talk offline about this, but I would love for you to share with this audience, because I know they'll really appreciate it, the vulnerability that you feel in putting your words into a book and sharing your story publicly. Maybe talk a little bit about that experience and what you learned.
Yeah, and I want to comment on what Jenna said on Smart Her News. I invite everyone to watch it because, Jenna, it's like having a friend in your living room while having coffee discussing the news. The way you present information is so personable, and you're right. The fact that there's no flash around it, the focus is really on the story and what you are saying. So congratulations for doing that and having the courage to actually present the news this way in this very personable and humble fashion focus on the facts. It's so good. It's just, I think, the future of news and the future of storytelling on social media, and we see it. I chose to go and write a book, which it took me 2 years, and my co-author on this is Carrie Wyatt Cantu, stayed persistent with me, and I wanted to share two things. One was the story of the Policy Circle, what it is, how it functions, the women, the amazing women that I met throughout this. And as I said earlier, I wanted to share also my personal transformation in the last 5 years. I'm a very different woman than I was just 5 years ago in terms of the confidence that I have, my ability to think strategically, to connect the dots, and the amazing network, and I don't like to call it ecosystem of relationships that I've developed around the country, and that's just incredible, right? So I wanted to share that, and I wanted to share it not necessarily in a linear way, right? I wanted to share the story of the Policy Circle in a way that would be helpful, and I decided to kind of create this roadmap of 8 trusts that you need to develop, to develop real trust in yourself and trust in others, which is the foundation of a healthy society and of a fantastic life. So I kind of went through and we were able to discern these different trusts and then find stories around that. Some are my personal stories, and some are stories of women in the Policy Circle, women that helped me build the Policy Circle. The initial volunteers are my good friend who was our very first contractor who helped build the website. Molly it would not be what it is today without the technology and the heart and soul that she poured into it. And I wanted to share those stories and the stories of transformation. I felt like I'm not comfortable. As Jenna said, you need to pick the medium that you are comfortable with. I am not comfortable live streaming like Jenna, although Jenna, you give me courage when I see you, but I don't think I could be at that level. And I'm not, blogging about myself. It's not really that. I need to have a step back, a much more withdrawn approach, and then think it through and have multiple passes and create a roadmap for something bigger. I'm kind of a systems thinking, a process-minded person. So that's how I created the book. I have it here. And for those of you who are not, it's called Trust Your Voice. Finally did it. And it takes a lot of courage. And Carrie was the one pushing for the stories, and I would sometimes just mention something, and she's like, wait a second, what was that? What did you do? Like, so you ran 40 miles for your 40th birthday, and you made that a whole community event, and everybody participated, and people started running marathons after that. She would pull out these stories that I didn't think were necessarily interesting, but and then pull them together in something that made me approachable, made the stories approachable, and hopefully creates a tool for young women, for women who want to feel like they need to find a pivot in their life, find a focus. This might be a great tool to ignite the potential and embark on a new journey.
One of the elements of storytelling, too, is this idea of the stories that we tell ourselves. And I had this amazing woman who's a professional storyteller and keynote speaker on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and she has a new book that's coming out by that same name. But it really has gotten me thinking about, we've talked a lot over the course of the last 3, almost 4 years about imposter syndrome and about sort of dealing with self-doubt and doing things that are hard and pushing ourselves to do them anyway, and having cheerleaders and supporters like Sylvie, who says, no, you should do a podcast. Notwithstanding the fact that I'd never listened to a podcast at that point. But let's talk a little bit about this idea of the stories that we tell ourselves, how we get past what can be a challenging voice who can live inside our heads, who's not always the most constructive person, I'll speak for myself, but my guess is you guys can probably relate. How do we deal with her? How do we deal with the stories that Negative Nellie sometimes tells us?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like that it's a very strong voice, very strong, and you're so right to point it out. I think storytelling is not a destination. You know, a doctor practices medicine, and we have to practice storytelling. And so when that negativity comes in, and for me it comes in quite a bit. I got little kids. I've been building this company for 3 years, and it's the audience, but I don't really know the pathway forward, and I can't really figure it out, and how am I going to do it, and what is it going to be, and all of those things. It's where you have to remember that effective storytelling is also about listening. The best storytellers are not the best orators. They're the best listeners. The best interviewers are not the best questioners. They're actually the best listeners. They're in the moment, and they're responding to what they hear. And we're often told, like, don't listen to that voice, right? Don't listen to, ignore that voice. But it's a developing story that we're all living in our own lives. And it's not that, I don't think we should ignore those voices sometimes. I think that they're pushing us in a way that we need to be pushed. And although they can be very difficult, we don't want to embrace them, we also just want to acknowledge them. And acknowledgement is important because it's causing us to ask the next question and the next question and the next question. And those questions are then developing the story. So even asking yourself, why am I doing that? Why is this recycled in my head? And really, if that question keeps coming up, it's because you haven't answered it yet. So then you can't get to your next chapter. So that's the way I look at it. But listen, this week that was something I was experiencing. It's a regular basis, and so hopefully that's helpful. It's about listening, but not staying stuck.
Yeah. Sylvie, how about you, from your standpoint? How do you get past that self-doubt that sometimes is there and keep pushing forward?
Yeah, I think, I feel like you need to have a set of belief you have to have a certain level of what you are good at and what you are not good at, and to just acknowledge it, right? And that requires you to maybe do some different evaluations and tests. There's a lot of tests out there to help do that, but it helps to know your strength but also to really know your weaknesses, and therefore, once those weaknesses pop up, you say, yeah, I'm not really strong in that. And you just move on, right? And I think that's one place to go. And that's what Jenna was talking about labeling it, acknowledging it, that story that you tell in your head, and then move on, letting it go. The other part, I think, is to have a strong set of values, of things that you believe, so that you say what you believe and you do what you say. So everything is aligned, and it's from the moment that what you do is different from what you say or what you believe, that's where you start telling yourself stories, negative stories, and things that you feel it's not feeling right, when there's this dissonance. So I think it's worth taking the time, and I think in this very fast-paced environment that we are, we don't necessarily take the time to perhaps put pen to paper and list out what it is that we're good at, what it is that we're not so good at, what are our value system, and then what's our gift to the world, right? For myself, I get really excited when I ignite the potential in others, right? Your story about the podcast, it's true. I just called you. I said, I think you should do a podcast. I didn't know you very well even to say that, but I mean, that's what really excites me. And I think if you focus on that and what's your gift and how you ignite the best in others, I think it helps you just pass and shut down all these self-doubt and all these negative thoughts. That's how I look at it.
The podcast that I produced that's up this week is with a woman, Dr. Samantha Boardman, who's written this book called Everyday Vitality that I urge you guys to check out. It's really fantastic. She tells a story about being a med school student and getting the question from one of her professors that said, what's the purpose of therapy? And she gave, several answers. No, that's not it. He's like, the purpose of therapy is to rewrite your past. It's not about your present or your future. It's about your past and the story that you tell yourself. And I think one thing that's really important that I think is maybe a good leave behind for this audience is being willing to rewrite that story. There's so much focus on authenticity, and that's all great, but not if it stops you from pushing forward, if it's limiting you in some way, versus you being willing to embrace that and taking the pieces of your story that you want to continue to carry with you and build on those pieces, as opposed to being like burdened potentially by those other elements. And I thought it was such an interesting and thought-provoking way of thinking about our stories and our evolution, our evolutions in life. We're constantly evolving and changing. We're not the same. We're constantly growing, and we're constantly rewriting our stories.
Excellent.
So with that, we're out of time. I am so grateful to you both. What fun to have Jenna here and to meet her. You guys make sure and check out Smart Her News. And Sylvie, thank you as always. I miss you. I'm glad that you're here with us virtually today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, guys.